They didn't bury the Colt story in a graveyard. They buried it in ledgers, in factory walls, in polished museum glass, where blood looks like varnish and suffering reads like progress. And if you listen closely, under the hymn of American industry, you can still hear it, the soft click of a revolver cylinder turning like a prayer wheel, counting out the next generation. And most Americans know the name Colt the way they know thunder, loud, inevitable, supposedly natural. A brand, a legend, a piece of history that gets taught with clean hands. Samuel Colt, inventor, entrepreneur, Hartford Prince of Steel. The man who made a weapon that could repeat itself, and in doing so taught a young nation a new kind of confidence. One that didn't require closeness, one that didn't require courage, one that didn't require looking another man in the eyes. But the documents don't talk like the monuments do. And in the oldest correspondence, ink faded, paper browned, there's a hunger that doesn't sound like patriotism. It sounds like obsession. A fixation on mechanism, on leverage, on multiplying force. A belief that if you can turn violence into a system, you can sell it like any other product. And once it's a product, you can stop calling it sin. You can call it innovation, and Hartford, Connecticut still carries that decision in its soil. The armory rose beside the river like a fortress of payroll and smoke, and families came for wages the way desperate men come to a church in winter, not because it's holy, but because it's warm. They worked under the promise that the machine would lift them, that the future would be kinder than the past. And then the future arrived, shaped like a pistol, perfectly balanced, perfectly repeatable, perfectly indifferent. And here is the part they don't put on the guided tours. A repeating firearm doesn't just change battlefields. It changes kitchens. It changes arguments. It changes the ending of a man's worst night. A nation can tell itself a story about defense and destiny, but families tell different stories, stories whispered through walls, stories that start with, wasn't like that until, and end with silence. And the Colt family, behind the gates, behind the philanthropy, behind the public reverence, was not spared from the kind of haunted mathematics they helped introduce to the world. In the archive, you can trace it like a stain spreading through paper: ambition, secrecy, illness, sudden death, and the slow, careful management of an image that could never admit what it cost. And because once you build an American myth out of a weapon, you don't just inherit wealth, and you inherit echoes. Before the factories, before the blueprints and brass plates, there was a boy with a talent for spectacle and a mind that wouldn't sit still inside the limits of ordinary conscience. Samuel Colt grew up in a country still figuring out what it was allowed to become, the kind of place where a clever child could be praised as a future genius one day and warned as a future devil the next, depending on what he was caught taking apart. And in the surviving fragments, letters, family accounts, the polite biographies written after the money arrived, there's a careful brightness that feels rehearsed. But if you read them the way an archivist reads a will, you start noticing what's missing. The pauses, the sudden changes in subject, the way certain years are described like weather, quick, forgettable, difficult. And Colt learned early that Americans love a show. As a teenager, he traveled with exhibitions demonstrating nitrous oxide, laughing at the way grown men stumbled and confessed their secrets while the crowd roared. It wasn't just science, it was power, temporary theatrical power over a stranger's body. The record calls it entertainment, but you can feel something colder underneath, the discovery that people can be controlled, and that the crowd will pay to watch it happen. And then comes the shipboard story, the famous moment where he supposedly watched a wheel or a mechanism and imagined a cylinder that could turn, chamber after chamber, like fate itself. Whether that moment happened exactly as it's told doesn't even matter anymore, because the myth served its purpose. It washed the idea clean. It made the weapon sound like inspiration instead of intention. But the Colt house carried another kind of intention too, one that rarely makes it into the authorized history. Because while Samuel was constructing a future out of repetition, his family was already learning what repetition does to a mind. And in 1842, Samuel's older brother, John Caldwell Colt, was accused of murdering a man in New York City. A printer named Samuel Adams, found dead after a confrontation that began as an argument and ended as something final. Newspapers of the time treated it like a social infection, respectable blood turned violent, a well-dressed man exposed as capable of the unthinkable. John Caldwell Colt was arrested, held, and then, before a verdict could seal the family name, he died in his cell by suicide. And that's the first hard crack in the polished Colt legend, not because a brother's crime defines a man, but because of what the family did next: the quiet management, the careful closing of ranks, the insistence that the scandal was contained, isolated, nothing to do with the rising armory empire. And yet when you follow the paper trail, you start hearing the same note again and again, like a hammer striking metal. A family learning early that there are two histories in America, the one you tell in public and the one you lock away before it ruins the brand. By the time Samuel Colt's invention found its footing, it wasn't just a tool anymore. It was an idea with teeth, an idea that could be copied, multiplied, and shipped wherever fear could be converted into money. And once that happened, the Colt story stopped being a biography and became a machinery of its own. And Hartford didn't simply build a factory. It built an ecosystem. The Armory complex grew into what people later called Coltsville Worker Housing Company Influence, a small city orbiting a single purpose. In the official language of the era, it was benevolence, wages, stability, modern industry. In the private language, what you catch between lines in old labor notes and local accounts, it was dependency. The kind that makes a man careful about what he says, because the same hand that pays him can also erase him. And Colt's genius wasn't only mechanical, it was social. He understood something that still runs through America like an underground current. If you can convince people a weapon equals safety, they will accept almost anything attached to it. They will accept the factory smoke. They will accept the endless shifts. They will accept the way injuries become coincidence, and exhaustion becomes discipline, and grief becomes unfortunate. And they will tell themselves it's the price of modern life, because the alternative is to admit the price is too high. And the revolver sold not just because it worked, but because it promised control in a country that was never fully controlled. Colt's business moved with the nation's anxieties, expansion, war, policing, the push into contested land, and the quiet, constant dread that the next conflict wasn't far away. That dread was profitable. The Armory answered it with steel. And then here's the part that sits like a stone in the archive. Repeating weapons don't stay on the frontier. They return home. They enter towns, saloons, bedrooms. They turn domestic arguments into permanent endings. The records won't call it of legacy, but you can measure it in the way coroner's reports change over decades, in the way newspapers begin to treat gun death as a common weather event, tragic, familiar, almost routine. And meanwhile, inside the Colt household, the family name was being sealed into myth with the same care that pistols were packed in crates. The scandal of John Caldwell Colt didn't vanish, it was absorbed. The lesson was clear: if the family's darkness became public, it would threaten the entire machine. And so the machine had to keep shining, and Samuel Colt died in 1862. At only 47. The public story is tidy: genius burns bright, then goes out. But the timing matters. The nation was at war with itself, and the factory that bore his name was positioned at the center of that hunger. He left behind a fortune, an industry, and a family that now had to protect a legend without the man who built it. When Samuel Colt died, the myth was supposed to stay alive on its own, self-winding, like one of his mechanisms. But legends don't maintain themselves. They require caretakers. And sometimes those caretakers are grieving people who learn to turn mourning into architecture and pain into public memory. And Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt became the widow America preferred, dignified, charitable, almost regal in the papers. The kind of woman a nation could point to and say, look, industry builds not only weapons, but refinement. Yet if you study what she did after his death, you can feel the pressure behind it. Not just the pressure of running an empire, but the pressure of sealing a story shut before it started to rot. And there was only one child who could carry Samuel Colt's bloodline forward, a little boy named Caldwell. In the family's private world, he wasn't just a son, he was continuity. He was the promise that the Colt name would remain a living thing and not a brand stamped onto metal. And then, before he was old enough to understand what his last name meant, he was gone. And the records speak in the soft, respectful language used for dead children: illness, suddenness, God's will. No scandal, no courtroom, no headline that could be managed into a footnote. Just that particular kind of loss that doesn't make noise. It simply hollows a house out from the inside and leaves every hallway feeling longer than it used to. And you can see how Elizabeth responded, not by loosening her grip on the world, but by tightening it. She memorialized, she built, she commissioned. She turned grief into stone and stained glass, into institutions that would outlast a human body. In Hartford, the church she raised in their memory stands like an apology that never uses the word sorry. Beauty offered to the public as proof that whatever darkness existed in the Colt orbit had been purified. But the year the child died, the armory burned. A fire tore through the Colt factory in 1864 and reduced a cathedral of industry to wreckage. Hartford watched smoke boil into the sky, watched the place that made repeating death become its own kind of funeral pyre. Officially, it was disaster, an accident, a tragedy, the inevitable risk of progress. Unofficially, people always whisper after a fire like that. About motive, about insurance, about what might have been easier to erase in ash than to explain in daylight. And Elizabeth rebuilt. And that's the point: most histories admire resilience, determination, the Colt spirit. But in the archive, resilience can look like something else, a refusal to let the story end, even when the bloodline already has. After the fire and the rebuilding, the Colt name stopped being attached to a single family in the way people imagine dynasties. The bloodline, in the strict sense, thinned out. But the name didn't, it spread. It moved from a household into a nation's hands, the way a contagion moves, quietly, person to person, generation to generation, until nobody remembers the first patient. And that's what makes this story different from the usual American tragedy. There isn't a neat ending where the curse dies with the last heir. The Colt legacy didn't need heirs anymore. It had customers, it had contracts, it had a place in the American mind that no obituary could touch. And walk through the decades and you start seeing the pattern. Wars come like storms, and the factory answers with steel. The Spanish-American War, the World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, each era with its own rhetoric, its own flags and speeches, and underneath it the same simple requirement: make more, faster, reliable, repeatable. The product changes shape, but the promise stays the same. Control in a chaotic world. And in Hartford, that promise soaked into everyday life. The city's pride was wired directly into the armory's survival, which meant people learned to swallow things they couldn't say out loud. Injuries become part of the job. Explosions become accidents. The stress a man carried home after 10 hours of noise and metal and chemical stink became a private matter. The kind of private matter that can turn a quiet father into a stranger without warning. And this is where the archive becomes uncomfortable, because it stops being about famous people and starts being about unnamed ones, men whose identities are reduced to payroll numbers and census marks. Their stories don't make plaques. Yet they're the ones who lived inside the machine that the Colt myth required. And here's the unbearable thought the Colt story forces on you if you keep reading. The revolver wasn't just an invention. It was a new rhythm for American life. A rhythm of escalation. A rhythm where disputes don't have to cool down. Where despair has a shortcut. Where a teenager can reach for a family heirloom and end a lineage in a single motion, and the newspaper will call it senseless. As if the sense wasn't engineered, marketed, and sold for generations. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And because whether your last name is Colt or not, the question is the same. What do you do when you realize the most profitable American stories are sometimes built on the kinds of pain families spend a lifetime trying to hide? By the late 20th century, the Colt name no longer lived in a single mansion or a single widow's careful hands. It lived in boardrooms, in lawsuits, in contracts written so cold they read like weather reports. The legend had matured into something Samuel Colt would have recognized immediately, a mechanism that kept turning long after the inventor was gone, grinding up whoever got too close to the gears. And Hartford changed. The river kept moving, but the city around it began to thin. Industries leaving, neighborhoods aging, the old confidence draining out through cracks in brick and asphalt. And there, like a stubborn relic that couldn't decide whether it was sacred or cursed, sat the Colt Works, still carrying a name that promised permanence in a country that eats its own past. And then came the fractures you can actually date. And in the 1980s, Colt faced a brutal labor conflict, years of tension snapping into a strike that dragged on and hollowed out trust on both sides. It wasn't just about wages, it was about dignity, about whether the people who spent their lives shaping metal had any claim to the future they were helping manufacture. Newspaper accounts from the period read like a family argument that turned into a siege. Picket lines, replacements brought in, resentment hardening into something that didn't melt even after the gates reopened. And when work resumed, the damage didn't stay at the factory. It seeped into identity. A place like Hartford doesn't just lose jobs, it loses a story it tells itself to survive. The Colt name had been a local religion for over a century, and now the congregation was watching the church split. And in the early 1990s, the company went into bankruptcy. That word hits different when it's attached to a myth. Bankruptcy is supposed to belong to weak things, mismanaged things, temporary things. But Colt was never marketed as temporary. Colt was marketed as inevitable. And if you listen to the old interviews, the older workers don't describe it like a business event. They describe it like betrayal. Men who built weapons for wars they never fought. Men who believed their hands were part of an American backbone, suddenly learning that the backbone could be sold off in pieces. And that's the quiet horror at the center of the Colt story. The violence was never only in what the company produced. It was in the way the name trained generations to accept hardness as normal, hard work, hard choices, hard endings. The Colt legacy didn't just arm America. It taught America how to think about power as something you either hold or something that is used on you. So what do you do with a story like this once you've seen the seams? And because by now, the Colt legend should feel different in your hands. Not because the company is uniquely evil. America has built plenty of empires on suffering, but because Colt is one of the cleanest mirrors we have. It reflects a nation's private appetite for control and then dares us to call it virtue. And the final layer isn't a hidden murder, or a secret basement, or a missing diary page that proves everything. The final layer is worse than that because it's ordinary. It's the way the Colt story kept working even after the bloodline fractured, after the brothers' scandal, after the child's death, after the fire, after the strikes, after the bankruptcies. The mechanism survived because the country kept feeding it, and Samuel Colt's genius was never just that a revolver could fire multiple shots. It was that he understood repetition as a business model. Repetition is culture. Repetition is fate. Once something can repeat, it can become tradition. And once it becomes tradition, people stop asking whether it was ever healthy in the first place. And look at the way the name still moves through American life. The way Colt can still mean reliability, masculinity, heritage, coded words that hide fragility underneath. Because the truth is, the Colt myth offers a shortcut out of fear. It whispers that power can be purchased, carried, kept close. It doesn't mention what power does to the mind when it becomes the solution to everything. And then that's where the family horror becomes national horror, and a brother kills a man and dies before the verdict. A child heir disappears into the ground before he can grow. A widow builds beauty on top of grief and calls it legacy. A city ties its identity to a factory and then watches the factory chew through livelihoods. Generation after generation learning, in different ways, that survival means keeping your hands steady even when your insides are shaking. And if you came here expecting a simple villain, you won't find one. That's what makes it unsettling. The Colt story is not a haunting because it contains one monster. It's a haunting because it reveals how easily a society can build a cathedral around a tool of death, and then act surprised when the cathedral casts a long shadow. And somewhere in Hartford, the old brick still holds heat in summer. The river still moves past the place where men once shaped metal into certainty. And if you stood there long enough, if you listened the way historians listen, you might hear what the archive has been trying to say the whole time. And the past isn't past, it just changes hands. And then the nightmare isn't that the Colt family had secrets. The nightmare is that the secret became American.